So welcome everyone to the Agile HR Community's one of the case study meetups, where we have Agile practitioners sharing how they have been using agility in their own work with their organizations and customers. We run these meetups once a month or every second month, and usually they have been very much appreciated by our community to be able to learn from others and get together in the easy format. We are not having a lot of slides, or we are just having a conversation, maybe showing a couple of pictures, but nothing more than that. So you can actually go out for a walk, you can do some cooking or do some cleaning up while you're listening to us and learning at the same time. Our fantastic guest today is Lea Ralic. So welcome very much, Lea, to our call today. I'm so glad that we can have you. We got together a year ago, starting to learn about agility, and you have been working in large-scale HRIS programs, and I'm really eager to hear what you have to share. Insights, learnings, fails, successes, everything. So let's get into that soon. Now I'm going to hand over to, first, of course, say who I am. So my name is Riina Hellström. I am the founder of Agile HR Community and happy to be here hosting today. But the main host is actually going to be Lea. So Lea has prepared and is going to facilitate a learning session and sharing session today for us. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Lea so you can introduce yourself and take over.
Hi, everybody. That's me. I'm Lea. And let me just share my screen very quickly so you don't have to look at my lovely face blown up full size. But yeah, so very nice to meet you all. Lovely to see that we've got a few participants and lovely to kind of hear from Riina about the Agile HR community. So actually, like Riina said, we met, I'd say it's probably even a bit more than 2 years ago, because we met before the pandemic. So I remember attending
true.
An actual real live meetup. Remember those where there was like 60 people in the room and we had post-its and placards all over the walls. It was quite fun. At the time I was working at something called the HR Innovation Hub, which was looking at how exactly what kind of Riina was doing on a large scale. It was looking at how you can kind of do HR projects and HR work in a slightly more agile way. And we also used Scrum. So just really quickly about me, I have a few years of experience in HR. So I did quite a lot of things in just general kind of HR operations and management, and then did a little bit of the Agile HR kind of projects at that time. And then I transitioned over into kind of HR transformation and particularly HRIS projects. So it's been really nice learning about not just HR, but also, and not just Agile, but how to put these two things together in a way that makes the most sense. And yeah, today I'm here to attempt to talk about what I've learned and attempt to talk about kind of some of my thinking around this space. So I guess when I was thinking about this, and kind of taking some of Riina's recommendations and input on kind of what to do and how to best present it, it was, my mind really took quite a lot of different routes, and I wanted to talk about so many different things. But I ended up kind of wanting to really frame my thinking and my conversation with you guys around kind of where we are, kind of what we've learned, how we can really leverage Agile, and I can talk about a little bit about some examples that I have from real life, and then also where I see us going. But as I said, it's really something that I feel is a conversation that is most valuable if it's shared between all of the different people who are interested in this space. So I definitely invite you in. I guess to start with, I spent quite a lot of time over the past few weekends kind of reflecting on and trying to systemize some of my thinking around where we are with HR technology, and also, really importantly, how did we get here? Because I think that is something that really isn't necessarily super related to the way that we apply Agile in HR, but in some ways it should be. So hear me out, right? I guess there's a few distinct phases in the world of HR and the history of how HR was done. And all of those phases are also marked with pretty large shifts in technology. So I think if we think about, at HR about 30 years ago, it was really the olden days, I called it. It was a lot of manual work. It was a lot of forms, a lot of paper, a lot of printing. Any tech to help you do things would be very costly and also very local. And this, what I'm calling the skills barrier to entry. So the amount of skill or knowledge that you have to have about technology in order to be able to influence or input into it was really high. So it was kind of a time where everything was a little bit manual, sometimes for really good reasons, other times because it was very costly, both from a skills and a money perspective, to get tech to do the right things that you needed to do. And then I think as we transitioned out of that, HR kind of transitioned into a lot of very bespoke, decentralized, small sort of technologies that popped up all over the place. And for the majority of companies that work in one or two markets that are kind of small to medium sized, that was never really a big issue because that transformation was already huge, from going from a manual, fully paper-based model to something where you now have databases and you have, kind of relatively low grade tech to really help you get things going. Was never an issue. But I think as you went into larger scale organizations, as you went into organizations which really kind of have a huge amount of complexity, both from the perspective of how they do work, where they do work, how many different forms of work there even is, even from an HR perspective, that started to pile up quite high, quite quickly. So all of that decentralized tech was, creating its own cost. All of it was creating its own skills cost as well, because that meant that you had to have the skills to maintain all of these different things. And the skills barrier to entry was still really high. So a normal HR professional who doesn't, isn't a coding expert wouldn't be able to really influence a huge amount of how that tech worked. They could give a couple of requirements. They could say this is what it needs to do, but really it was kind of more in the hands of the IT professionals to get that going. So that's what brings me to the little arrow, which is what was the HR perspective on this at the time. And I think it was kind of purely driven by that skills barrier to entry. And it kind of felt like this is just a systems project. This isn't really what we do. When we do something with tech, it's always going to be, this big bang change. We're going to change everything, launch that, make that really successful, but not very often. And it's really owned by IT. It's not owned by HR. We're kind of the customers, right? And I think that sort of thinking and that sort of approach to how you enable HR to do their work is something that's kind of bled into current approaches. And unfortunately, I think that there is a danger of it bleeding into the future approaches of how you do HR.
I was just wondering, this is the time as well when I think that many HR people said, at least I did, I was like, I don't know anything about IT. I don't want to have anything to do with this. It just has to work, kind of a talk, So also a reluctance of really understanding how software works and how software is developed and how requirements and how we set up the possibilities for the users to do a good job. That didn't really exist in our language.
No.
10 years ago.
No, exactly. And I think that change is coming about, and it's coming about quite quickly, but the tech itself is probably moving even quicker than that. So I think that's where we're in that danger of still having the idea that it's an infrequent big bang. It always has to be change managed to perfection, rather than kind of seeing it for a slightly more cyclical approach, which we'll get to pretty soon.
And of course, if I just may offer this as well, HR people in today's world are using applications and software everywhere, not just at work, but also privately. And if our software is worse than the usual ones that we use every day, that also starts telling us a story that we need to upgrade these things.
Exactly. And that's how we get to where I think we are now, right? And we're at the one to rule them all. Slight nerd reference there. Sorry, couldn't resist. But a lot of those companies, which accumulated all of those kind of local tech systems and decentralized tech systems, at one point in the last 10 years had figured out that the next big leap, the next thing that they really needed to do was bring all of that data together. And I distinctly remember a story from one of my old workplaces where the CEO wanted to see how many people are employed by that group at a given time, right? And their team told them, give us a couple of months, we'll give you a number. And he said, what do you mean, give us a couple of months? This is information that we need to have at our fingertips every single day. And I think that was probably a conversation that a lot of leadership teams went through at that time, where they figured out that what they have works for those small scale systems, but it didn't bring the whole picture together. So a lot of those enterprises ended up going to enterprise systems. There's quite a few out there, but most of them are cloud-based. So they hold all of that information somewhere, and it's kind of available immediately worldwide. Mostly worldwide, apart from usually Germany and Austria, who have very interesting data laws. But generally, it's kind of something that was the next stage in the evolution. And the interesting thing that happened there, I think, is that when all of that work had transitioned into sort of a one big enterprise sort of cloud tech, the tech cost actually reduced. And most importantly, the skills barrier to entry reduced, because all of these systems understood that in order to make them work, they couldn't be the only ones who owned that product, if that made sense. So they understood that the next stage in the evolution is to give a little bit of that product ownership role, a little bit or a little bit more, depending on how ready the companies were for it, to the HR teams themselves to define what it is that they need to do. But rather than then go back through the whole loop and kind of say, okay, these are the requirements, this is everything we need to do, they made the product relatively simple so that it can be configured to your liking and to your requirements relatively quickly, which made the relationship, I think, between HR and HRIS quite a lot more collaborative and quite a lot more quick, because you could say, actually, this isn't what we need anymore. We need something quite different very quickly. And whereas previously it would genuinely have been impossible, with this new approach of having like a cloud-based, centralized sort of tech, it really became a lot more possible. And that skills barrier started to drop, where HR professionals could enter that world and could really start to understand all of those words that Rena just mentioned, like requirements, you know, and the life cycles, and how that software gets built, how it gets deployed, and how they can really partner with the IT function, or in some cases own it, to make sure that it works for them. And this is where I think we're at the cusp of something new right now, which I think is going to be quite different to what we have today, which is kind of the cloud-based central tech. I think the next step in that evolution, which is quite obvious if you look at what all of the big players are doing right now, is in the kind of machine learning supported tech, which means that all of that data that we now have, all of that information that is held somewhere centrally in the clouds, is going to get utilized in the right way. And that skill barrier is going to drop even lower. And that's where I think the HR perspective is necessarily needs to change from, you know, this is something that we just do very infrequently, and then it's a project and we assign certain people to it, and we tend to keep it in that little box over there. Like Rena said, because technology is kind of bleeding into all areas of our lives, in work, it has to, by necessity, bleed into everything that we do. And that partnership needs to be a lot stronger between HR and tech, because that change is becoming more and more frequent. And by it becoming more and more frequent, it's kind of giving some, like, it's giving incremental value on quite frequent cycles. And the better you do those cycles, the more value you can extract out of any of those systems out there.
Would be lovely to hear. So where are your organizations currently? If you're looking at 1, 2, 3, and 4 in front of you right now, could you write in a chat where approximately your organization is? Is it still decentralized tech in different countries? Have you gone to the cloud, which would be number 3? Are you number 4 already using what's in the cloud, machine learning, analytics on top of that, so that everybody can have the value of the cloud system?
Yeah, I think probably considering kind of the wider sort of landscape, I would say a lot of companies are sort of in between 2 and 3. A lot of them are fully on 3, trying to prepare for 4. But as I think somebody's mentioned on the chat, it's not something that just happens overnight. And a lot of the systems are still finding their feet as to what that even means and how to do that in a proper way. I hope that resonated with you guys. It seems like the 2s and 3s are, it kind of was relatively clear for most people. So good to hear that. My next sort of thinking in this space was around actually what that means, getting from 3 to 4, getting from that sort of where we are today to where we really need to be, and how that impacts the cycles of work in HR. And I've just put together these 2 fairly simple circles that kind of expand a little bit on what the waterfall model brings for us in the HRS world and what an HR product ownership model would. And I'm sure that you have all seen these sort of circles reinvented 700 times before. So I'm not trying to reinvent the wheel, pun intended. But I did think that it was really, really important to put them side to side, because the difference between the 2 in an HRIS system is actually quite astonishing. Particularly because for waterfall systems, the amount of debt, the amount of kind of little things that happen that you then need to unpick at a later time, years down the line, is really evident when you look at HRIS. And I think the reason why I love these so much is because when you talk to HR people, and when you talk to HR people about Agile, one of the first things that I've always heard personally is that's something that comes from tech, right? That's something that comes from software development. The language isn't familiar. We don't like it because they use all these like terminology like Scrum and backlogs, and nothing too complicated, right? Especially for somebody, for most of you who are kind of certified HR Agile professionals. But it's still, there's a bit of resistance to that because it's kind of, it comes from software. And I think it's a great place to start then to say, actually, if you look at HR software, that's a really brilliant example of how you can properly do Agile projects in HR with software support. So let me go first through the waterfall model. And I am sure that all of you have your own war stories around how this happened. And if you've ever been involved in an HRIS project in your organization, I'm sure this will feel painfully familiar, right? So you go through a big bang change, you go through this huge transformation project. Usually it's either a migration from one system to another, or it's like a huge redeployment of a system. And it takes years. It takes years off of your life in the end, because you're spending, months and days and sometimes even nights looking at, long lists of requirements or long lists of, payment plans or compensation matrices, all that really exciting stuff. And you finally go through that big bang change. And then, naturally, as kind of work progresses and time goes on, issues come up, things change, strategy changes, just even the regular maintenance stuff comes up where you need to change certain things because the law has changed, or the teams have changed, or your company's kind of changing direction. And all of that change needed goes into usually a pretty large loop of kind of hierarchical decision making. And where that's not possible to implement, where it's not possible to just wait for something to come down the grapevine after 6 months, and a lot of times you get people who get really, really creative. So a lot of the times when we go into an organization, you see a lot of pretty creative workarounds being implemented to answer some, fundamental issues in how they use that technology. It's quite funny because when you talk to HR, they'll say, "Oh no workarounds ever." But then when you look at the system, everything is workarounds. There's so much in there, really creative work that's meant to give you what you really kind of have an acute need for. But because it's a waterfall model and because it doesn't have anybody kind of looking at it from a really holistic perspective, all of these workarounds are sort of peppered around the system, and sometimes they work against each other. And where they work against each other, they make the experience of using the system usually terrible after a while. So usually you'll see people saying, "I don't have access to this information," or this is preventing me from doing this other thing which I need to do. And when those issues become critical, and when people start being really loud about the fact that they hate using it and they don't think it's useful anymore, you go through another one of these big projects, you do another one of these big bang changes, and it starts the model all over again. And I think that's something that probably a lot of organizations that are trying to do proper transformation now are going through and are learning pretty quickly, that this isn't something that is sustainable, especially when the technology that we're looking at is moving so quickly.
We all have those stories, and I have a picture that I would like to share with people who are not very technically oriented, but that will talk about technical depth that this left-hand side will start building. Can I just share that quickly?
Yeah, of course.
Tend to use this picture to explain, if we start or continue building our processes and our HRIS system with the left-hand side waterfall way, this is what it leads to. I love this picture talking about, this is how we built it, with all those workarounds, everything that keeps it together somehow. And people are asking for a simple thing, and it's really, really difficult to start changing anything because there's so much patching up that we've done with the system. What are your thoughts when you see this?
This is, I'm going to steal this picture, because a lot of the time it's really difficult to describe what technical debt even is, especially to HR people. And it's like, yeah, but in order to put that one window, we kind of need to put the wall back first.
Correct, exactly. And this explains it so well. And anybody who's been dealing with HRIS system understands it, specifically if you're looking at that you need to have all the requirements and specifications upfront described before you even do anything. I mean, we were working with a HRIS system, and we went into, having done all those modules of how recruitment works, how onboarding works, how exit works, how contracts work, etc. Then we came to the process job change and realized that it changes everything. Single one of the previous ones.
Yeah.
And we ended up with, this is literally what this file name was. It was, job change version 5, final version 25, ready last one version 5.5, something like that.
Last one.
No, it's last one. Now no more changes. And then we realized, there's a small little detail that we need to fix, and everything needs to be upfront described. And that's the problem here. We can't really.
100%.
It's so complex.
100%. And it is genuinely a very, very complex thing. Ooh, wait, let me just put this back. It's a hugely complex piece of work, but it's also I would say it's a hugely complex sort of project to run. And especially when you add all of that technical debt on top, where you have all of the stuff that's patched up, even beginning from the complexity and then building all of that in is genuinely like building a window onto a house that doesn't have a wall because you had to take it out to make recruitment work. Yeah. And this is, I think I'm probably going to steal this one because it's very topical for a lot of the projects that I work on. Right. So that's the waterfall model. And that's, I think that picture explained quite perfectly what happens if you continue kind of working in that regard. But I think even the products themselves are sort of lending themselves a lot better to what's on the right-hand side, which I've not accidentally put green arrows on, which is what we're calling the HR product ownership model. And I know that that's something that a lot of you will be very passionate about, and something that I'm sure as part of the Agile HR certification is something that we talk a lot about is, where's that delineation between, HR and IT, and also how you properly do product ownership with HR. And I think HRIS systems is really something that lends itself quite perfectly to this model, because if you implement that kind of the change incrementally, any sort of issues in maintenance and change that's required, even change in direction, is something that's taken in as a normal thing in that model, and is dealt with as part of the kind of being prioritized as part of the backlog. So if you have proper agile decision making, and by that I don't mean having scrums and daily check-ins and having a retrospective at the end of every 2 weeks, but that you actually have a self-organizing team with a product owner who prioritizes work across strategy and BAU work. That is something that really lends itself well to any sort of HRIS system maintenance and development. Because if you think about what a backlog is, it really, in most cases, it is exactly that. So you have a bunch of BAU work, business as usual work that's just kind of, your regular changes. You need to add a payment plan somewhere. You need to delete an absence plan from somewhere. And then you've also got a bunch of strategic, really important work, like you need to enable people to move around the organization quickly. You need to understand what skills you have and what skills you're missing in an organization. You need to do all of that with usually with one kind of system, and prioritizing that work appropriately across the ecosystem is something that I think we're still searching for the best way to do it. But I think the best way that we have right now in HR is the product ownership model, because you then look at what value those new solutions bring and what value these changes are going to bring, and you prioritize that way, which kind of then lends itself to more change being implemented incrementally. No big bang train of changes hitting the employees, the managers, the leadership. Nobody is kind of, up in arms about everything's changed all over again, but you're kind of doing that continuously. And really, if you think about setting yourself up for success in the future, that is something that, from an HRS perspective at least, is, I would say, is one that everybody needs to kind of get on board with, because those cycles of how often you make that big bang change, if you look at them, they're shrinking and they're becoming smaller, because the tech is moving on so quickly that the technical debt and the people debt and all of those windows that you need to put in somewhere, they are accruing much more quickly than they used to. And moving to something that is really underpinned by Agile and really underpinned by properly Agile kind of cycles of decision making is probably our best bet in kind of keeping in step with how the strategy is evolving, how the market is evolving, how our businesses need us to evolve as HR professionals. So that's kind of the difference between the two. And in this one, hopefully you never kind of have to take out a wall in order to put in a window. But of course, nothing's perfect. And obviously, things do hit the real world sometimes, and they don't always end up being exactly what you imagine. But the closer you can get to that, having properly self-organizing teams and having real product owners who have real decision-making rights on these kind of HRIS systems is a real kind of shows a lot of agility and lends itself to bringing a lot more incremental value into those systems over time.
I was just thinking, when you show this on the right hand side, is also when you talk about mandate and have a product owner in place, in my opinion, and what my experience is, it's super important that this product owner also has access to the budget, so
Yes.
that the product owner has gone through kind of getting guardrails, some kind of guardrails of, okay, here is a budget. This is allocated to a bigger chunk of strategic project or strategic changes with the system and the processes and releases, whatever
Yeah.
we have. And these are for continuous improvement and maintenance. This is for totally new development of these 3 streams of work that we need to set up. But within those guardrails, the product owner needs to be able to make quite quick decisions so that they don't have to go to a steering group with a meeting, once every quarter to get everything approved in a steering group. That slows it down, so it becomes impossible to do in an agile way.
Yes. And I would probably add to that the number of people who have a say in a decision, because I think one of the things that we've learned from Agile, right, is that things tend to move quickly and more efficiently if there is quite a set number of people working on something, usually between 3 and 9 with a product owner and a Scrum Master, right? But not needing to apply these things, completely fully, right? I think it's still quite important that those decision rights are sitting with the product owner. And to your point, it's very hard to have decision rights if you don't have access to the budget. So it's something that I think HR is kind of hitting the wall, because a lot of organizations have quite a consensual kind of culture where everybody needs to sign up to something, everybody needs to agree to something. And particularly with HRS, it's really easy to see that, unfortunately, changes aren't always going to be great for everybody. They are going to introduce a little bit more pain to some people, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the overall value that you unlock from implementing that change isn't worth it, right? And that's why it's so important that decision-making rights are clear and that they are sitting as low as they can in the organization without making it, completely off the rails, because that connects it to the people who are actually delivering the work. So that's just my personal 2 cents on this one. Last one, I promise, and this is a wordy one, right? And I just wanted to kind of say, where do we go from here, right? And why is it important that we evolve these ways of working and that we really do consider Agile to be the next best practice in HR management, and the product ownership kind of way of working as the next best thing in HRS product management. And that's because I think that the next step we're about to take is pretty much exponential. So what we've seen so far, numbers 1 to 3, they've all been pretty big changes, but they have been kind of linear, going from one thing to the next, and you can really kind of see, you can see years in advance how it's going to work, and you're kind of waiting for the tech to catch up. This age that we are in now is probably where we're starting to ramp up on a pretty exponential scale in terms of how the tech can enable and can support the thinking and the strategic priorities that the HR function has. So the first thing that I think is happening with kind of the cutting edge HR tech, which really does utilize those machine learning models and predictive analytics and all of those fancy words, is that it enables HR to unlock value for all employees across all of their levels. Because I think in quite a few cases that I've seen, a lot of that HR value, career development, talent management, how to get the most out of the resources that are available to you through your employer, that has really always been kind of held at the top. So you have your leadership where it's a little bit of hand holding to say, dear Mr. Leader, there are all these things that can help you, and we're going to create some personalized plans for you. And there's also that 20% of people who really are on it, and whatever you put in, whatever sort of systems or resources you give them, they're going to proactively go in and really take advantage of them. But you still have quite a large section of most organizations that aren't as interested. They're not going to spend, 2 hours out of their working day figuring out a learning system that you think is great. But they do still want to develop in their careers. They might not want to be SVPs. They might not want to, lead whole business units, but they do want to have great, fulfilling work. They want to develop in their role. They want to learn about the things that they're interested in. And I think with those machine learning models that are coming in, both in learning and in talent and kind of career development, it helps remove that necessity to have a huge amount of people curate things for you. And it, even if it's not yet there, it's not yet perfect, it's not yet where we all want it to be, it's already helping to unlock value for all of the employees, because that means that you can be, not necessarily on somebody's, priority list, but you do still get all of that, and you get it curated for you. And again, you will get as much as you put in, right? But the barrier to entry isn't that high. So all you need to put in is your interests, your kind of a couple of things about you, and then it takes some of that work off of you.
It's just, I think what you're talking about is super intriguing for us in HR. We need to understand the strategic implications of this as well. And also the part which everybody tends to talk about is privacy, and what the ethical implications of these are as well. So a couple of things which I think is really important, kind of practical things, is first of all, even if you see this as a future and you're not there yet, please start preparing for this stage where your data is going to be used for machine learning purposes, artificial intelligence, etc., and start thinking about the architecture of your data. Just an example, I was working with a big company that had a couple of different systems. So they had the cloud system with the core HR and the processes, but they had like feedback systems outside that and something else. And they didn't use the same ID for people in these systems. And this led to the thing that they had to start cleaning the data up in some systems before, because they had not understood that they need to use the same ID. Because if you have the same ID, identification of a person in different systems, that today's analytical system can just grab data from different pods and just start crunching that. But if you don't know if Lea is Lea also in the system, it doesn't bring you value. So just to, even if you're not here yet, you can start doing that architectural thinking of what needs to be in place for us to later use this data. Another example is annotation of data. That means that if you have a piece of data, sometimes you have to explain what this data is. For example, pictures, hashtags. Okay, this is a picture that includes an umbrella and a road and three people and whatever, a dog. So they can find it later, so that the algo which is looking for pictures with dogs can find it later. Nowadays, we've got visual identification of pictures, etc., but you need to annotate some data. And if you think about these things already in beforehand, it's going to be much easier to take the steps towards high value driven people analytics later on. Just wanted to kind of mention that here.
Exactly. And I think that's where the value for business bit comes in, because apart from all of that value for employee, it also unlocks all of that value, which you just mentioned, for the businesses, which is around, what you do with your data, making sure you have not just the right data, but up to date and correct, which is a big challenge in today's world, and supporting those cycles, which then, if you have all of that set up, if you have all of that in place, that leads to better recommendations, which leads to better experience by people. And then they trust you enough to give you more. And that kind of goes into like a virtuous data cycle, we're calling it. But I think where Agile comes in here is that, unlike having to do these huge kind of leap of faith type of programs, this is really the time to experiment. This is really the time to pilot. This is really the time to do those small scale incremental value type things, because where previously you kind of had to kind of take everything and put it somewhere else, and then take everything and put it somewhere else. Now you really have the opportunity to leverage all of these new technologies, all of these new kind of exciting things, and really see what works for you. Because the next, I think, big balancing act will be between, having what's called like best in breed systems, which are really great at doing that one thing that they do, and having the one system to rule them all, which has maybe 70% of what you need, but it makes the management of everything so much easier. And that balancing act is something that you can do theoretically, but it's so much better if you do it practically, and if you actually utilize kind of those agile decision making and ways of working and small scale projects to really have evidence-based decisions, rather than just having an idea of how something might work, because that's going to enable you to get on that exponential curve and get on those virtuous data cycles much more quickly.
When you say experiments, Lea, do you have any great examples that you can give? I've got one which I can share, but when we're looking at, for example, large companies where you've got HR process owners, usually process owners. I like to talk about experience owners nowadays, or journey owners. But if you're still with the process ownership, so people who, I'm sitting on how global recruitment works, right? This is my hat now. And I think that I have all the answers, and I have the absolute truth at how it should work. And then I'll tell the HRIS people that this is what I want. Now, how can I run some experiments on the system? Because anything I want to run as an experiment is in my head is very expensive. How could I set up some smaller experiments to understand what I should tweak in my global recruitment practice?
Yeah, isn't that the $1 million question? I think all of the big companies that I know of are struggling with exactly that. And I think the answer is in doing it small scale. So when you really want to do something, when you really want to test something out, choose a population. A lot of the times there's quite a lot of people out there who are interested and want to experience things. So I know one of the companies that I work with, they have something that they're calling like their digital squad. And it's a team of it's not one team, it's a pool of about 2,000, 3,000 people who have proactively put their hand up and said, anything new you want to test on us. Like, we'll show up for calls, we will help you do your employee experience testing. They actually write their scenarios for themselves. So they get, you put a product in front of them and they go like, okay, so as an employee, what I would like to know is this, and this. So how are you going to do this? We're not going to give you any guide or input. And basically that pool of people that you have that have proactively just said, look, I want to see stuff, I want to help you make this stuff better, is hugely influential. And I have seen cool stuff come out of there, which the product owner, the process owner, or the tech person wouldn't have thought of, because they're coming at it from completely different perspectives. So I think that's a really basically no cost, but a really influential kind of example of something that you can do to make this better.
Yeah, I've been working with two projects and two examples, which I might share here as well, because practical examples talk so much. The first one was a retailer that wanted to redesign their recruitment practice. And they, of course, had the recruitment system set up and how it works, the flow of work was set up, and approvals and blah, blah, blah. And we said, we think we have a better idea on how to do this and get you better salespeople throughout the bulk process. But we couldn't set it up in the system. So what we did instead was actually run manual recruitments. We did a test of 10 people and 10 people, ran through that manually, and saw that the people who came through that pipeline, those new pipelines, were actually better salespeople than the ones that came through the existing recruitment pipeline. So we could do that outside of the system, manually, try it out, small scale. Yes, it took us some work, but we got evidence that it works better.
Yeah.
So that talked that gave us evidence that we needed to set up some digital tests up front, etc., so we could streamline the process. And we actually cut the time that the managers were spending on recruitment from 16 hours down to 4.5 hours with redesigning the process and automating it. So it was evidence-based all the way. We did many of these different tests and saw that, okay, now we got it working. Then we kind of wrote the description and the specifications, and then we changed the system. That's one way as well. And then the third way is that when I was working with a global HR team, they had not thought about prototyping at all.
Yes.
So instead of just taking the requirements from the global owner as is, they said, okay, before we build this into the system, let's prototype it. So they had 3 different alternatives of what it looked like and what the functionalities were. They went back to the product owner and back with some information. They actually did that pool of testing as well with real people to say which one would be easier for you to, understand if you're going to do a job change or exit the company. And they, like this, with a short iteration, they actually improved it quite a lot. So those are just examples of how you can do it.
Yeah, 100%. I would always say, prototype as much as you can. Ask real people, ask people who, are on the ground, they're not HR, and they don't have these complex ways of thinking about these things. Ask them how much effort are they willing to put in? Because I think people get really surprised when they realize that the normal employee doesn't really want to put that much effort into learning a new learning system or learning a new, how to apply for a job for the 3rd time in 3 years. They don't necessarily care that it's in their, company's colors. What they care about is, I get there, I know what I'm doing, I click submit, it's done. And I think that bit gets forgotten really quickly. And that's what the prototyping really pulls out very clearly, because people are always gonna, if you have an option for people to have a workaround, they're gonna find it. They will, I promise.
I'm just aware of time. We've got 5 more minutes. Would you like to start wrapping up with your biggest insights from the HRIS scene with agility? What would be your recommendations?
I think we've basically just covered that. So I think I would say my biggest takeaways are understand your decision-making structures and how they influence and impact how agile you can be, regardless of what words you're using to describe the work that you're doing. And the other one would be really make time to prototype, because with HRIS systems, that's the easiest place in which you really can prototype, and you really can kind of run these small scale little changes which help you understand how a big scale change is going to land. And I think those 2 things, if you get them right, everything else kind of falls into place.
I'd also like to refer back to what you started with, to have that product owner who knows what they are doing, who has the mandate to make decisions. And also one thing for my expectations for a product owner, if they would be reporting to me, I would like my product owner to know exactly how the product is performing. So metrics, setting up metrics on, are we getting the impact that we want to? Where is your product lacking? Where are the dropouts? Where do people not follow through with the process? What's happening there? What are the biggest problems next on your list that you're going to fix? So starting really to lead those products is one thing that my expectations would be for a product owner. What's your outline for the future and agile in HRIS? Do we need more product owners? Do we have that capability in place? What should HR people start doing, the people who lead this forward, to build this capability?
I think that we are definitely going to need a lot more product ownership. And I think we're definitely going to have to revisit some quite traditional ways of working and decision-making structures in HR. I think that's probably one that a lot of companies are realizing is going to be painful and different, and is going to feel quite out of control for a while, which for HR I think is quite a big deal. From a capability point of view, I believe that HR is going to need to get a lot more involved in the systems work, not to code or anything, but to understand what the systems can do so that they can refine their requirements to be able to, drive these large scale programs. Because I think one of the main issues that I've seen is that a lot of the times it's kind of like, we don't really want to know what the system can do. Here's what we want to do, and make sure that it does exactly that. And if you tweak 5%, it can be 70% more effective, easier to maintain, much more straightforward for you, for the employee, for HR, for everybody. But not having that understanding of what are all the things that it can do I think is really impeding our progress as a function, and our ability to kind of strategically execute on the systems, if that makes sense.
It makes perfect sense. And also that this should be a continuous conversation. It can't be a program that you run once every 10 years. It is now time to step up to see that digital is married to people operations all the time, and we need to keep up continuously with keeping that updated, so we don't end up with the picture of the technical and can't really do anything with the system going forward. I want to say a massive thank you, Lea, for sharing your expertise, your knowledge, and your insights. I think that you are on top of something which is going to be very key for us in HR and people operations to succeed, given that everything is about data, digital nowadays. And even more now when we are remote, where we need to take care of people in a totally different way than before when we sat there together. So thank you so much for taking the time, everyone as well, for being here. Thank you, Lea, for sharing your expertise. It was lovely to have you on. Have a fantastic summer for those of you who are in the Northern Hemisphere, and if you're in the Southern, take care of yourselves in the winter. Thank you, everyone, and
thanks so much. Thanks for having me here. It was brilliant, and I hope to stay connected with you guys. It was a lovely, lovely conversation.
Amazing. Thank you very much, Lea. Ciao. Bye.
Bye.